Thanks everyone for joining us again at African Philosophy Conversations. I'm very pleased today that Dr. Bernard Matolino is my guest. Dr. Matolino is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Kwa-Zulu-Natal in South Africa. He's widely written and widely read. He works in philosophy of politics. He works on questions around personhood, in ethics, and I want to get into all of those sorts of things in our conversation today. So, welcome, Dr. Matolino. Great to see you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Janz, and hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Well, why don't we start where I usually start, which is getting you to talk a little bit about how you found your way into philosophy in general, and then African philosophy in particular.
Yes, thank you very much. I found my way into philosophy in a very interesting way. Initially, I had wanted to become a Catholic priest, and as you'll know, it's compulsory for Catholic priests to take up philosophy as a formal subject of study and qualification.
Right.
So after 5 years with the Dominican order, known as the Order of Preachers, OP, I decided that I did not have that calling, but philosophy had kind of stuck with me as a viable way to spend my life. So that's how I found myself in philosophy in general, and in African philosophy, it was out of curiosity, really. Even though I'm in Africa, and South Africa in particular, all my philosophy training had been under white males. So I was taught philosophy by white South African males. Mm-hmm. And I remember in my master's year, I asked one of my lecturers, whom I was close to, why we had never learned anything on African philosophy throughout my years of studying under them. And his answer was quite telling. He said to me, simply because I've never been interested in those kinds of things. So I made a decision when I started my PhD that since I was African and was largely ignorant of African philosophy, it would do me some good if I were to choose a topic in African philosophy to pursue for my PhD thesis. And that's how I ended up in African philosophy. And I've been working on a number of African philosophical themes, as you have said, and that has become my home. Yes.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that and I don't know that it would be you'd get the same kind of answer today. At least I would hope you wouldn't get the same kind of answer, although maybe you would from some people. But the idea that it just almost hadn't occurred to people that there were interesting questions within African philosophy or relevant to places within Africa seems strange, doesn't it?
Yes, it's very strange, but you'll remember that these questions arose even in the 70s and 80s, right, about the nature of the South African philosophy department.
Right.
The South African philosophy departments have for a very long time always wanted to identify themselves either as continental or analytical.
Right.
And staff spend a lot of time trying to specialize and showing their expertise in those areas, depending on which university they are at. So the demography also is interesting in that philosophy in South Africa is still up to this day largely a white pursuit. Of course, there are some young people, young Black African, South Africans who are coming up, and that must be welcome and encouraged. But the professoriate, for example, is largely crowded by white South Africans, and of course probably their own cultural interests and identities tend towards the Western world than issues that arise here.
Right.
But there's been some transformation. I think almost all South African universities at least nominally teach a course on African philosophy. At the very least.
I think you're probably right about that. I mean, I don't know absolutely every one of them, but pretty much everyone I can think of, yeah, has to a greater or lesser degree. And some of them have really tried to make it a much more central part of the curriculum, not just a course, but like a program or a major, or putting African philosophy into, any number of different courses, which I think is a good move.
Absolutely, absolutely. But as you know, transformation will be slow.
Yeah.
But there's been a shift. So
Right.
if a student were to ask today any of their professors why they're not doing African philosophy, they wouldn't get the sort of response that I got.
Right.
Most likely, a student today in any South African university will be exposed to African philosophy to some degree.
Right.
You're correct in saying some universities have really put it at the center. There are one or two centers I know that are African philosophical centers, but that transformation is coming, though slow, but it's still coming. And in the change of the demography of the teaching staff, I think we'll get better results with time.
So I'm interested in one of the central questions in your own writing, and that's the question of personhood. You've written extensively about this. You've written a book about it. You've been involved in a number of exchanges with people. So I'm wondering if you could start us off maybe by giving us a little bit of a kind of historical, philosophical picture about how this emerges as a topic of concern or a topic of interest within African philosophy. I mean, we could tell a Western story about this that would, maybe be a very liberal story, or be a very, a story about, defining characteristics of human beings as opposed to some other life forms or something like that. But what kind of question is it within African philosophy, and how do you see your contribution as being, like where's your stance, or where do you fit within that conversation?
Yes, thank you very much, Prof. I think the story is to some degree similar to the Western story. It's a story that's worried about what a human being is, how a human being is different from a person, what are the necessary conditions that qualify a human being to be considered a person, what sort of continuity should be regarded as qualifying in making a person probably not so much one and the same entity, but a kind of a stable entity. Not one and the same entity over time, but a kind of a stable entity that is identified as such. So for myself, and in my own research, which I pursued it when I was doing my PhD, and I'm glad to say to the audience, you were one of you were the international examiner, actually. So that question started when I was pursuing my PhD, and I wanted to understand what personhood is in African philosophy. I've been taught quite a lot in Western philosophy, and the last figure that I dealt with who intrigued me so much was Derek Parfit. And I wanted to see if the same sort of concerns that Derek Parfit has actually arise in African philosophy, and I discovered that they don't. So it's a different take to some degree. However, there is no one uniform approach to personhood, and in my career I've insisted on that we should take these different approaches seriously. The three approaches that I found to be extant were the force thesis or shadow thesis, then the communitarian thesis, then the metaphysical thesis. I've rejected the way that the force and the shadow thesis are presented.
And can you tell me a little bit about that? Like when you say that, what do you mean by that?
So the force thesis is an idea that is traced to temples, Placidi temples. Placidi temples, the Belgian missionary who worked amongst the Baluba of the Congo, developed this idea that instead of being African philosophers Africans choose to talk of force, and force is the total amount that effectively an individual communicates. So it depends on what the individual's life station is, how important he or she is in a community, whether they've got also some kinds of powers. Let's say if they were a traditional healer, or even a witch. They will be able to do things that ordinary people are not capable of doing, and that will give them a certain force. And he created a hierarchy of forces right from God up to inanimate things, with human beings also occupying a certain position there. And then the shadow thesis is one that believes that there is an attribute about people that can be described as a shadow. So that shadow encompasses also the kind of energy or strength you communicate, but it's also your essence, which some people have equated to the soul. And then there's the communitarian thesis, the one that understands a person as something that is formed within community as a result of the qualitative relations they form with others. So you have to be successful at those qualitative relations. And then there's the metaphysical thesis, which wants to describe persons as possessing certain distinct attributes.
Right.
You can find something like the soul, not quite, but something almost equivalent to the soul.
Right.
And then something equivalent to the mind. Interestingly, the soul and the mind are not made the same. And then the actual body. You can find also other attributes that are non-material.
Right.
And that's how the metaphysical version goes. However, in African thinking, what gets prioritized is the communitarian version, the one that says a person's identity is derived from the success they register in the relations they have with their fellow human beings.
I am because we are.
Yes, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. Right. So other people are seen as constitutive of you, and their actions and your actions have an effect on each other, including your standing as a person. Now, when I came into the field, I was dissatisfied by the manner in which these distinctions were laid out, and I thought to myself, we can, probably inspired by Occam's razor, I thought we can cut entities and not allow them to multiply beyond what's necessary. So I've been a defender of two approaches, the metaphysical approach and the communitarian approach, because I think the first thesis is one that straddles between the two. It identifies an element, but says this element is only realizable in community. And I've said, since it says this element is realizable in community, then we make it a communitarian project. And indeed, it has inspired some famous communitarians on the continent, such as Mbiti and Menkiti and the likes of Jechi have had to reckon with that. So I've done that, and I've insisted, and in the book that you referred to, I've insisted that actually the metaphysical view, the one that gives persons distinct elements as composite of their identity, should also be taken seriously. And of late, I've heard other scholars who are a little younger than me talking of social ontology in their defense of the communitarian view and their defense of the priority of the communitarian view. And I've insisted that that's fine, but we should understand that social stuff and communitarian stuff as if it were moral stuff, not as if it were strictly metaphysical stuff.
Right.
Of course, I have opponents, but that is my commitment.
Well, so I'm interested in, I guess, I mean, for lack of a better way to put this, what difference it makes. In other words, sometimes we think about the, as it were, payoff for thinking about persons in maybe ethical terms. So if we identify something or someone as a person, we have certain kinds of obligations towards them or commitments or something like that. In other words, figuring out what a person is has implications on a variety of areas. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, like what, given what you've just articulated about how to think about persons, what difference does that make in other kinds of areas?
Oh, a lot, particularly for me, as somebody who identifies as a political philosopher, this makes a lot of difference, especially on the African continent. You see, when I started with my PhD, I noticed that the political theory that had dominated the continent was African socialism. But African socialism made a certain kind of appeal for its justification to a certain understanding of personhood. Even though without being very explicit about it, you could clearly see that assumption, could see it running through. And we know what eventually happened. The so-called socialist states ended up failing in all sorts of ways, sometimes through no fault of their own, but where they should be held responsible is how they treated individuals as entities that belong to a communal view, therefore were to be denied certain political rights, which were seen as injurious to the common good.
Right.
And that created all sorts of funny dictatorships under the name of national unity, national interests, etc., etc. So for me, it became very important to clarify what we exactly are talking about when we talk of personhood, and what sort of things are to be expected from these entities that are identified as persons, and what sort of things these entities can legitimately claim to be entitled to, even when they are in community. Because one thing that I've seen, Prof, is that the notion of community is an inescapable frame of reference in African philosophy. You cannot even think about doing African philosophy successfully without either paying your dues to the community or explaining the community away in some detailed manner. But the community is so fundamental. However, what I'm now interested in is what sort of political communities can we formulate in the African sphere that may be sensitive to the peculiarities of our philosophical understanding of a person as a metaphysical entity, while at the same time satisfying some other requirement about the importance of community, both in reality and conceptually. And this is what I've been struggling with.
Well, and you know, you've taken us into philosophy of politics here, which is where I wanted to go. So let's go there. And I think you're absolutely right that there is a very spotty history of success, you know, in states that have been explicitly socialist, but there's been a spotty history of success in a lot of other configured states as well in Africa, and then some successes as well. And, you know, I'm interested, I guess, and I'd be interested in your response to this. I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, immediately after the fall of, you know, kind of the state level colonialism across the continent. You know, I won't say the fall of colonialism, because I think there's a strong argument that it remains in force in many ways. But the state level, in other words, the independence of countries. And, you know, initially you get these kinds of dreams of how, you know, how a country is going to, you know, strike out on its own, and it's going to do it, you know. I mean, so many of these figures had philosophical kinds of approaches in some way or other. I mean, starting with Kwame Nkrumah and consciencism, and you had Julius Nyerere and Ujamaa, and you have Kenneth Kaunda, and you have Senghor, and you have, I mean, just like it goes down the line. It seemed like if you were going to be the first leader of a country, you're going to have some philosophical basis for your country. And a lot of them, I agree, had a kind of version of socialism attached to them. You know, I think there were problems with a great many of those. Some of them flamed out entirely. You know, some of them were glorious dreams that never delivered. I'm thinking of Tanzania and you know, the Ujamaa sort of case. I mean, Nyerere as a figure is a admirable person. I think everyone would agree with that. And he had this dream of you know, bringing everyone together, and yet it really never kind of worked in the way that he thought it would. Against the backdrop, I mean, this is all happening against the backdrop of colonialism. And one of the things that colonialism does is it draws boundaries of countries in the most bizarre manners quite often, right? And so you're starting off trying to have a country that, you know, makes no sense ethnically, makes no sense sometimes even geographically, you know, certainly from the point of view of migration pattern. I mean, all of these things, it just makes no sense. And
Right.
so now these people are said, presented with, now you're independent. Now go and make a country. So do you have any idea what they could have done better than what they did do? Because I'm struggling to figure out, what would I have done if I was in that circumstance? I don't know that I would have done a lot better.
Right. Right. I get you, bro. I think one of the important things that we must come to appreciate is that even spending a lot of time, like some scholars have done, trying to blame these guys for getting these things wrong, will not help.
Right.
It will not help academically. It will not help even to appreciate things from where we stand right now.
Right.
I think there was a certain inescapability of fate for them. It's like they were fated to turn out the way that they did.
Right.
This was a new experiment for them. They'd just been handed countries haphazardly, as you correctly say, countries that did not cohere very well at many levels, but they were just handed these countries without a proper transfer of all the things that are needed at the level of exercising power to ensure that whoever comes after the colonial administration will be successful. But it also has got something to do with how the African has struggled with overcoming colonialism. So at the dawn of independence, it's about asserting a certain identity that is in contrast with the ridicule that has always been associated with the African. And this identity is good to be originally African. So the only option that was available to these founding fathers was to reach as far back as they could to an untainted epoch of African existence. And from there, they'll draw interesting political, economic, and social guidelines, which they'll seek then to implement to firstly retain a sense of dignity for the African, but also to find a different way of governing their newly independent states that did not reflect the brutality of the colonial governments. However, some people say the failure that happened had to do with the period in which Africa became free. It was a very tense period globally, with the Cold War raging, and wanted to quickly choose sides. And these founding fathers chose probably the wrong side. Some people may want to say that, and they were set to fail by certain people who had powers to make them fail. I don't know much about that because I'm not a political scientist, but I think African political theory must understand itself as an evolving project. So there was a point when most Africans had no problem with a one-party state in their own country. They were almost like okay with it. But the disintegration of one-party ideology was also accompanied with the real material impoverishment that ordinary Africans started to feel. And they then started agitating for better options or more options in their political spaces. And as they started agitating for these options, then things started happening to those options. And it was a recurrence of the violence that we had seen during colonialism. And the alternative then that was handed to Africans was multi-party liberalism. I'm not sure that the African state and its citizens were nearly as prepared as they should be to embark on this project.
And what preparation do you think should have been in place before something like that happened?
You see, Prof, that's where the difficulty is. It's not clear what preparation should have been in place.
Right.
Things happen too fast.
Right.
From oppression and being treated as second-class citizens who are actively fighting for their independence
Right.
and so-called equality or just freedom, then to having all this political power and political responsibility, and then being left to work out your own political direction and political theory, and then you work it out and then it fails. And then in order for you to continue as a recognizable or even respectable member of the international community, you then have to take up the project of liberalism.
Yeah.
And the project of liberalism was not an overnight event in the Western world. But in Africa, it was supposed to be an overnight event, and its failure is there for everybody to see. So I think we've been given false dichotomies here. As a thinker, that's what I think the false dichotomies we've been given. Firstly, this attempt at reaching into the past to find this pure state of affairs that may be retrieved, and it comes to inspire our present state. I like what Kwasi Wiredu, some will say the most famous African philosopher, said. He says, for better or worse, that past is gone. And the reality of the matter is that that past keeps receding further and further away from us.
Right.
And then the other option, which is also false, is the workings of liberal democracy.
Right.
That if you adopt the liberal democratic program, all your problems will immediately vanish. Accountability will be there. Justice will be there.
Right.
Society will suddenly be open, and it will be a meritocratic society.
Right.
That people will be responsible for their fate and destiny. And the more we introduce freedom to society, the more viable it becomes. So you find a lot of people arguing that there should be democracy in Africa, but they're not very clear about what they are going on about that kind of democracy.
Well, and it really gets back to what you were saying earlier about personhood, right? Because, that liberal democratic ideal in the West depends on a certain kind of version of personhood, which is very individualistic, very much, almost predicated on a 19th century economic model of markets, where, we are all, who we are is our revealed preferences, right? It doesn't really matter who I am on the inside. What matters is how I show myself to the world, what decisions I make, what actions I engage in. And if we focus on those sorts of things, that's what is that? That's voting for one thing, right? That's our revealed preferences, but how we buy things and the groups that we, choose to be part of in society and all of that. And so, I wonder how much, that version of personhood is just kind of like almost an atomic version, an atomistic version, right? Here is the individual first and everything else comes after: your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your this, your that. And what we've seen often in Africa is that things like ethnicity are really quite powerful, right? If you decide to have a kind of liberal democracy in a place like Kenya, well, it's going to be, inevitable that, the large ethnic groups, the Kikuyu, the Luo, whoever are going to dominate. Smaller groups may well get pushed to the side, or as under, Daniel Arap Moi, who was the, second president of Kenya, who was from a smaller group, he rallies them all together and he says, I'm here to keep back the big groups, and yet it became a single party thing as well. So how much do you think ethnicity is wrapped up with personhood when it comes to political life in Africa? Is it can we factor it out, or do we have to take it seriously?
It depends on where you are at, or which zone you're operating from.
Right.
I'll give you a very good example of where I am right now, which is South Africa. Though I'm not a South African, I've lived and worked here for a very long time. So far, since the dawn of democracy, 1994, so far it doesn't seem like ethnicity is a very big card, because the majority party has been able to draw supporters and even leaders from different ethnic groups. But you're absolutely right. In some places, it's a major point. And it's a point that is to be considered for one, who is going to be the leader, and two, what is going to be the dominant party, or some other dynamic in the political life of the country. Ethnicity will show its hand. And it goes again back to what you said right at the beginning. It's this arbitrary drawing up of borders with mixed ethnic groups, and also the very logic of colonialism, which was premised on divide and rule. Right. There were some ethnic groups which were favored by former colonial masters. They were given access to better education. They were given better infrastructure, and in some cases they were even made to believe that they were superior to their fellow Africans. Right. And these problems have got a funny way of carrying themselves through. How do they carry themselves through? Since Africa is largely underdeveloped, political power guarantees rather access to material benefit. Right. And the fights really are not so much about what should the dominant political theory that comes from this ethnic group be that will take our country forward. That's not the issue. The issue is who is in power and who is eating. So the phrase "our turn to eat" is popularized precisely for those reasons. And I think these are the challenges that we have as African philosophers, but also as African political theorists. So the challenges are twofold. One, we have got to think about how, as a place that has been through so much pain and degradation, we can overcome that. Right. And it's funny how these things work themselves out, both in thinking and in reality. Yeah. They've got a certain way of hanging around for longer than they should. Yeah. And you can't really pinpoint where they are operating from, but they are there. And then secondly, we also have got to think about our current state. Where are we as a people who are so divided, but also sometimes show signs of being united? What do we want to create politically? What will help us to create that reality? So what conceptual handle may lead to that reality? And that's what I think is fascinating, at least for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the question of how to look forward and how to create well, starting from the reality in which you find yourself. I mean, that's a huge question and a very difficult one to find your way through, because I think quite often you end up with, kind of easily packaged answers. I mean, that was, after all, the socialist answer early on, or other kinds of utopian answers, right? Just follow our plan and everything is going to be great, right? And, the ethnically based answer is, well, if our ethnic group, does well, then, rising tide lifts all boats and everyone does well, right? So maybe that is the kind of line that's used in countries that have a very, single, very large dominant ethnic group, like Uganda, for example, or to some extent Zimbabwe, maybe. And you could probably tell me better than I could if that would be the case there. But then there's the Kenyas of the world, which are pretty, they're 2 or 3 large groups and lots of small ones, or even more so Nigeria, which is incredibly diverse. Right. And then you need an entirely different logic to figure out how do you look towards the future, because like a grand utopian plan's not going to work, and just look after the major group and everything else will follow. That's not going to work either, right? Because there is no major group. Right. And so you get credible histories of unrest in some of these places.
Absolutely. And I think the interesting thing about Africa is precisely what you have pointed out. The dynamic of the ethnic card as a political tool plays itself out differently in different places. So there was a time, for example, in Zimbabwe, where it really mattered whether you are Shona or Ndebele, especially after independence, when the Gukurahundi happened under the watch of Robert Mugabe. And Ndebeles clearly felt that they were being victimized by a Shona ruling class or
Right.
a Shona leader or whatever the case was. But people seemed to transcend that very quickly when the politics was changed by the introduction of Morgan Tsvangirai, who took on Robert Mugabe, and the MDC appeared to have ceased to be a Shona on the Ndebele party. It had this broad national appeal, but also the other major party was able to reformulate itself and have an appeal to whoever it could appeal to, not necessarily on ethical lines, sorry, ethnic lines. But it's true that ethnicity shows itself in a variety of forms. They are not always going to be uniform, and they are not going to be violent to the same degree. In some places, it could be just the violence of exclusion without bloodshed. In some places, it will actually be bloodshed. In some places, it will be little bloodshed. And in other places, it will be just knowing your place. And all these are disturbing developments because they really undermine the idea of person that we have. We can't value a person based on the ethnic group that they come from. That will be a weird way of thinking about persons. We want to think of persons as entities that are equal in some way, that are deserving of the same kind of respect, that are capable in engaging in humane relations, which are the foundation of theories such as Ubuntu or any other version that is communitarian. So that's really the challenge. And I think my colleagues in the African philosophical space are a bit slow in approaching political theorization with the kind of determination that I think it deserves, particularly for for a continent that has got so many political problems, some of them coming from the past, some of them coming from, let's say, our immediate past, some of them solidifying themselves or emerging in the present. I'll tell you something interesting. There's one problem that I see in the future of Africa. Many people think it's an advantage, but I don't think it is. The explosion of the youth population. We've got so many young people who literally are just sitting around doing nothing. These young people, if a devious person comes along, are ready to take up arms for a cause that sometimes does not make sense. And they can be used also in ways that do not benefit their interests. But they are also an existential threat that if they were to become restless, they've got capacity, they've got the energy, they've got the strength, and they've got the mind to be up to no good. But we don't think about them so much, except just as a percentage of the unemployed. And these are things that we should begin to factor in our thinking. If you don't mind me saying this quickly, I've been thinking of late about how important in our political theorization on the continent it is for us to depart from traditional models of political theorization, where we start from the abstract and work our way towards what then can be real. We've got a lot of real stuff that requires some sort of abstraction, even to better understand that reality. So political theorization, and I'll attempt this in the near future. I think in a year or two, I really want to attempt it in a meaningful way. Political theorization on the African continent, I'm now convinced, must start with the reality. And what is that reality? It's the reality of fragmentization, the reality of the perpetuation of hopelessness and disempowerment. And it's also the reality of people who feel even alienated in spaces that they should be enjoying and flourishing in. So that's my current thinking in that respect.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that, but raises some interesting problems to try and think through that, because that's a huge problem, it seems to me. I mean, the disaffected youth that you're talking about, I mean, at least some of those, are born frees in South Africa who have grown up with the promise that once apartheid fell, there was going to be opportunity for everyone, and it has not panned out that way for a great many people for a number of reasons, right? Some of them maybe not preventable, but many of them probably preventable. Um, you know, I'm interested, and you bring up the youth, and I think that's actually a really interesting place to kind of uh, think through this. I mean, the trajectory for Africa, if you look at the demographic trajectory into the future, and I'm talking throughout the rest of this century, some of the largest urban areas in the world are going to be on the continent of Africa, right? Lagos is projected to be 100 million people. Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, I mean, there are a number of them that are just going to be massively huge. And so I'm interested in, I mean, you've expressed some kind of, lack of optimism maybe towards some of the traditional forms of governance and of political life within Africa, as unable to, deal with the reality that we have before us right now. That reality is going to get a whole lot more pressing with that many people. Right. Can you help me think through what political tools we might have at our disposal to think through that kind of future? I mean, it would be great if it was an optimistic future, but even just not descending into complete chaos would be nice. So how do we think about that kind of reality facing us in the future?
Yes, it's one of those intriguing things, really, about Africa. I can tell you a little funny story, and I've never done like serious research on it. It's like one of those things that you kind of just know. I know a few African countries that have been independent for more than 30, 40 years.
Right.
Yet they've never built a new city. The cities we have are largely colonial. There are spaces of development, what we call new money. So new money may sponsor certain spaces of development, and there could be comfort there. There could be large areas, but there hasn't been a creation of, in many places I know, of viable new cities where people can come and live and work and be productive, right, and enjoy a good life without putting pressure on the large cities that you talk about. The reason why there's going to be 100 million people in Lagos, it's not because Lagos is necessarily attractive. It's because there are no viable options elsewhere. Even if the options in Lagos are going to be rough, I really don't want to live in a city with 100 million or whatever million people, where I have to wake up every day to compete with a whole bunch of people just to get to town, to the central business district, etc. So I think one of the most important questions that may help us get through all of this centers around issues of development. Okay. What idea of development do we have in Africa? Mm-hmm. And what is that development going to do for Africans? How is it going to aid these millions and millions of youngsters who maybe soon will turn into 1 billion to see Africa as a place where they can have viable existence, right, fulfilling existence as Africans, with all the beautiful stuff we hear from communitarianism, etc., etc. I always give the example of that slum town in Nairobi, Kibera. Kibera does not represent dignified, right, communitarian, humane existence of any African at any level. Right. In fact, it becomes quite academically disingenuous to talk about these valorized principles of what it means to be an African who follows certain ethical systems as espoused by communitarianism. So I think these old systems are not going to do much for us. What we need are new notions of what the exercise of power really means, mm-hmm, and what that exercise of power may result in if it is oriented towards development, empowerment of people, and a more viable and sustainable experience of being African on this continent.
Right.
The only way that we can be viable as Africans on the continent is if we rethink what our goals and purposes are in the near future. And you're correct to use the term pressing. This is a pressing problem. So I think developmental philosophy is necessary in Africa, and I think at times it is important to have an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach to these problems. Economists work in silos, philosophers work in their own side, political scientists do their own thing. But if we're to have a multi-pronged approach to understanding development and empowerment, we could get different results. But these are tentative thoughts. Beyond this, I really cannot say much except express my fears of what the hold.
I mean, I think I'd be suspicious if you had like a nicely packaged answer that you just kind of presented with a little bow on top. You know, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, Kibera and you know, I mean, I think of Henry Odera Aruka, who towards the end of his life argued for what he called an ethical minimum, which, you know, could be interpreted in a kind of socialist manner, I suppose, but he was arguing for, you know, something that was a step beyond just human rights. He was arguing that there is a right to, you know, clean water, there's a right to decent, you know, education and things of that nature. And without that, you know, you can't get a society off the ground. And so, and he was in Nairobi, and, you know, I mean, and I've also been to Kibera, I've been to Mathare Valley, I've been to, you know, a number of these places around Nairobi that are pretty grim. You know, at the same time, and this is in no sense a justification of them, they are also places of often incredible energy and incredible creativity. You know, some of the innovations that I see, you know, that I saw coming out of you know, Kenya were from people who were seeing problems with existing structures and systems and finding a way around them. So, for example, you know, in Kenya, as in many countries in Africa, the banking system was extremely difficult to engage. Getting an account was almost impossible. You had to have 100 references and it took forever and all of that. And the phone system was also very bad. And so some clever people figured out that they could actually do banking using cell phones by exchanging essentially credits on cell phones. And all of a sudden you get this entire, you know, parallel banking system, you know, growing up, and it turns into M-Pesa, and Kenya is a world leader in, you know, mobile person-to-person banking because of that. And, you know, that seems to me to be an incredibly positive outcome to a very grim reality for people.
Right. I agree with you absolutely. As they say in English, necessity is the mother of invention.
Indeed.
This is exactly what you get in Africa.
There
is a lot of energy.
And
you know what? This is not an original idea, which I'm going to share with you now. Somebody said the reason why Africans are so innovative is because they have seen that the state is so obstructionist. It makes life impossible. Exactly what you were describing. All these requirements just to open a bank account, you'll find there's actually a law that regulates that. And it's from the state, and the state will tell you it's for reasons of stopping money laundering, etc. So Africans, this thinker series in political science, Africans every day wake up to bypass the state. It starts from something as small as garbage collection. The local authorities just fail at that, and garbage piles up. And those who want to live in a garbage-free area, you have to come up with a plan. And it may be a beautiful, innovative plan at the end. The banking system that you're talking about, I know precisely a lot about it because I've experienced those difficulties, and it's so innovative, it's unbelievable. People people in these countries started transacting through phones before even the Western world was anywhere near doing that.
Yes.
And it was so beautiful. But the problem, Prof, is that this energy seems to rise sometimes and spread at times, but it does not spread with the same vigor that turned the Western world into a modern place.
Right.
So it rises in patches. Sometimes it's not very consistent. Sometimes it's opposed by the state authority. Sometimes it only rises to solve a particular problem, and once that is solved, it ends. So this rethink, I'm reminded of Olufemi Taiwo's call that Africa must modernize, and this rethink must apply to all facets of our existence.
Right.
And an interesting thing is that theoretically, you may try to modernize, and the very tradition that some valorize as our foundation may resist those moves towards modernization. And some people are committed to both worldviews, and sometimes they don't always neatly dovetail to give you a productive or a meaningful orientation. So I find all this fascinating, and there is a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy on the continent, and sometimes it just dissipates, or it works in certain places. So one can say Africa is a place of possibilities and contradictions in equal measure.
Well, and what's interesting to me here is some people might think, well, now you've left talking about philosophy, haven't you? You're talking about economics, you're talking about sociology. No, actually, I think we're still talking about philosophy here.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, I think philosophers have a part in this, vision of what things might be, and a clear-eyed understanding of how things actually are now. And some of that comes through political theories of how we might govern better. Ethical theories of what it means to be an ethical person, and not just ethical in the sense of what we should not do, right? Because often people think about ethics in that negative sense of, our ethical theory is all the things you shouldn't do, and if we haven't said that you shouldn't do it, then well, you're okay to do it. But there's a whole other way to think about ethics, which is about flourishing. What does human flourishing look like? What is not just what does it mean to not be bad, but what does it mean to be good? Right? What does it mean to be supererogatory? What does it mean to go over and above? And all of these sorts of questions. What does it mean to, maximize everyone's values instead of thinking about ethics as a zero-sum game where if you win, I lose? There's so many ethical questions, I think, that kind of are woven through all of the stuff we've been talking about. So,
precisely the thing that matters the most, Prof, is, and this is a branch of philosophy. We talk about axiology. The thing that matters is the value of the African life, the average African. What sort of experiences do they have in life as an average African who lives on the continent? Is it even a life that's worth living? And in what ways can this life be made to be worth living? Because on a number of occasions, one comes across these very idealized discussions about ethical systems that really do not speak to the day-to-day reality of people who are supposed to be subjects of those ethical discussions. And some of the inhibiting issues have got to do with the existential reality of people. Right. So I prefer that old Egyptian model of the philosopher who started with what people really experienced and thought hard about what people experienced and proceeded to do something. You see, Prof, this is an old question that was raised by Wiredu's good friend, Abrahams, when he asked, what is the purpose of philosophy in a continent that has got so many material needs? Should money be spent on philosophers when the continent is still struggling to build schools, clinics, hospitals. As a university professor, I get paid from the public funds. Is it conscionable that I get paid a salary that could have built a small clinic and I contribute nothing to that society? So I think that kind of view of a philosopher may not be very relevant in other places, but it is very relevant in this place.
Relevant, yes, but I think there are answers to that question. I mean, I think we can clearly make the case that philosophers in Africa help think through some of the really difficult problems. I'm always struck by the fact that people doing African philosophy often turn to the past more than the future, I suppose. Think in terms of how do we excavate some sense of Africanity, whether that was pre-colonial or whether it's simply embedded within our practices now. And I think there's an African philosophy of digital technology. I think there's an African philosophy of the things that exist in Africa right now. Actually, let me show you something. This is one of my favorite pieces.
Okay.
So, this is a Coke bottle carved out of ebony from Kenya. Okay, and if you go into a market in Kenya, you see all sorts of carvings of elephants and of giraffes and of everything else under the sun. All of that stuff meant to be sold to tourists. White people like me, who have a certain imagination of what Africa should be like. And when I saw this, I thought, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen, because this is part of Kenyans' everyday life. Every Kenyan sees this every day. Do they see a lion every day or a giraffe or whatever? No, they don't. Most of them never see one of those, right? They never do, right? This they see. And so what better thing to carve than a bottle like this?
Right.
And I thought this is an example of, carving your daily life or making an object out of your daily life, and not simply catering to a kind of tourist imagination of what Africa ought to be like.
Absolutely, I agree, Prof. And one of my arguments has been that philosophy must be in the service of human beings.
Right.
Human beings must not be in the service of philosophy. So we must not chase after this Platonic ideal of what philosophy should be like and try to make this world of forms and whatever. We should try to use philosophy in ways that benefit us as human beings.
Yeah.
So, for example, philosophers in Africa, if they were to put their minds into thinking about poverty, what kind of contribution would they make?
Yeah.
But Prof, I don't know. I have not come across a book on poverty by philosophers.
No, I know.
Either as an edited volume or as a single authored volume.
Well, I mean, the only one I could think of would be Odera Aruka, who, was doing things that came close to that, and like I mentioned, his ethical minimum stuff and so forth. So it wasn't directly on poverty, but it was close to it. But you're right. I mean, there's just very little, and there should be more. Yeah.
Yet this is our existential reality.
Right.
And because you don't have to look far and hard in Africa to encounter grim poverty,
Right. Oh yeah.
It's always near you. And it's very real.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the humaneness of Africa, it's difficult to prosecute that point to a logical conclusion when it's faced with obstacles such as poverty and avoidable suffering.
Right.
So there are certain things that I think are very immediate and very relevant to us, but we are taking time in addressing them. We are also still captured by old questions of the nature of African philosophy.
Yes.
Okay, we've kind of agreed that it exists. So nobody goes around asking that question, but its nature is still a hot topic.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think we should get on with the business of doing real philosophy and and not waste trees by publishing books that
Right.
to
Exactly.
advocate this nature
Yeah.
or this nature.
Yeah.
So there are lots of realistic stuff that's interesting, but not only for Africans, but maybe for other people as well who may have either an interest in Africa or general human welfare.
Right.
That we can talk about.
Right.
But I think it was a warning that was offered by D. Masolo, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly. He said sometimes people avoid discussing these issues because as philosophers, these issues are too close to home. I don't know if it presents some kind of psychological complexity that you can't tackle these issues that are close to home. As you may know, I have tried tackling one issue which is very contentious on the African continent, the issue of LGBTIQ communities, and what seems to be targeted in most parts of Africa are gay men.
Right.
And they're targeted for not only social exclusion, but it also appears for political persecution.
Yeah.
And this is an issue that seriously requires our attention, and it requires a certain philosophical contribution that may help societies probably understand these issues better.
Sure. No, I totally agree with you on that. And it doesn't help when someone like, Jacob Zuma or others say, well, we had a traditional way of doing things, and that traditional way marginalized, LGBT people, which is factually false. But
Right,
there's an appeal to that, notion of tradition, and so
Right.
all of these, we have LGBT people because of colonialism, because of Western influence, because of this, because of that. And, so you get that argument all the time, and it's, and undergirds that, brutality really towards LGBT people, and this is not only in Africa. I mean, I'm in the US where, in Republican states, they are now passing laws where, in my own state of Florida, you're not supposed to talk about being gay in school,
No.
and things
Right.
like, I mean, it's kind of, censorship and suppression of ideas, but they present it as if it's, we're protecting the children because, we don't want them to hear about these, scary and weird things. And
Right.
so, we're going to protect the children when in fact it's just, harming children. So
Absolutely.
so it is in Africa, but it is everywhere too.
No, I get it. And the scary thing is that people, either through self-censorship, even in spaces that are protected as the academy, where you won't be persecuted about thinking and writing about these things, either through self-censorship or through fear of being identified as in cahoots with gay people or something like that. They don't want to venture into that terrain. But
Right.
It's a terrain that matters. It's a terrain that touches on a number of issues.
Right.
Let's go back to a personhood question. Are gay people going to be considered as persons, or somehow you're going to exclude them because in this communitarian framework there is no explicit discussion of it, though JG makes passing reference to it. So it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Maybe but it's tricky. That's my view.
But I think, coming up with views on personhood, and maybe these are test cases. Can you honor persons who are gays and lesbians who maybe, does your theory leave them out, or does your theory include them? And that to me is a pretty interesting kind of litmus test for a theory of persons.
That's why, Prof, in my latest book, Afro-Communitarian Democracy, I revisit two crucial issues: that of what a person is, and secondly, what type of political community will serve this person better. And I argue that a person is an entity that should be accorded a dignified existence. Materially and intellectually, they should be assured of the security of pursuing a dignified existence and a certain freedom intellectually or just in terms of thinking that they can associate themselves with. And once we have that understanding, we are going to create communities that are interested in defending persons who are also interested in the same project. So making human dignity the center helps us in building better conceptions and better realities of what these persons are and what the communities they live in are going to be. So having a lot of people living under unnecessarily harsh conditions compromises their own sense of the self. And that's where we should start. We should start with addressing conditions that have contributed to injuring this sense of the self and how those conditions should be overcome, at least theoretically. And I think those are interesting things that can happen. I attempt them, and I think we have an obligation to create communities that care, as opposed to insisting on relational communities.
Yeah, I mean, I am totally on board with you on that kind of goal. I have kept you here probably too long, but I have one last question, which is, when you are teaching, when you're talking to students who maybe don't have a background in African philosophy, how do you bring them in? How do you interest them in African philosophy? Is there something you talk about? Is there an article you give them, or do you talk about some ideas or some individuals or something like that? What do you do to get people involved or interested?
Thank you for that question, Prof. My major aim is to shock my students into thinking about what it means to be Black and African. So my starting point is the beautiful article by Emmanuel Chukwudi-Eze, I think it's titled Men in the Humanities, where he discusses how masters of modern Western philosophy were obsessed with the question of men.
Yeah.
And we've got these quotes from Hume, Kant,
right.
Hegel, where they disparage the Black man completely. Yeah. And that shocks my students into waking up into an understanding that the African or the Black man was seriously written out of philosophy.
Yeah.
Then I take them to understanding how that Black person has tried so hard to fight their way back into philosophy, starting with temples, then the likes of Masolos, discussion of ethnophilosophy, the fights that happened around ethnophilosophy. Wiredu's attempted decolonization. And then by then they've got the picture. They've got the picture. And great. Then I pick one topic of discussion. It could be personhood, it could be something on consensus, and it could be something on Ubuntu, depending on whatever I pick. So that's my approach. And as I said, it's a shock therapy. It's been working so far.
Well, that's great. And Emmanuel's article is so good, isn't it? I mean, he was just a really wonderful writer and very clear writer, but also very well researched. And
Absolutely.
I think he would be very, very pleased to hear that his article was being used in that manner. I knew Emmanuel. He and I got up to all sorts of things, and before he passed away, and this would definitely please him to hear that.
I'm happy to hear that, Prof. I only met him once at that St. Augustine conference.
Oh,
that was in Johannesburg. Yes, that was the only time I met him.
Yes, I was at that one as well. Yes,
you were. You were one of the key speakers.
Yeah, yes. No, that was a lovely little conference. Gerard Walmsley organized that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, it's been just a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could keep going on for a long time yet. There's a lot more to talk about, but thank you, Dr. Bernard Matolino, for being part of the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Prof. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay.